the heavy knock didn't just wake me. It jolted a survival instinct I had sedated for 10 years. Spotting the deputy sheriff's badge gleaming under the porch light. With my parents lurking behind a truck across the street, I felt no fear, only cold clarity. They thought weaponizing the law was clever, forgetting that I unearth financial bodies for a living. By showing up at 6 in the morning, my parents had effectively dug their own graves. My name is Vera Ridgefield, and silence has always been my loudest companion. At 10 minutes to 6 in the morning, the world outside my Victorian inheritance was usually a bruised shade of purple, caught somewhere between night and the weeping gray of a Washington dawn. I was already awake, of course. I am always awake. Sleep is a visitor that stopped knocking on my door years ago, replaced by a chronic, hyper-alert insomnia that makes me excellent at my job and terrible at being a human being. I was standing in the kitchen, watching the dark swirl of coffee grounds bloom in the Chemex, measuring the water temperature with the precision of a chemist. The house was breathing around me, the settling of century-old timber that sounded like old bones cracking. Then, the silence shattered. It was not a polite rap. It was a heavy, authoritative pounding that rattled the stained glass in the foyer. It was the kind of knock that does not ask for permission. It demands submission. My heart did not race. My pulse did not spike. Instead, a sheet of ice seemed to slide down my spine, cooling my blood, sharpening my vision. I set the kettle down on the coaster, careful not to make a sound, and picked up my phone to check the security feed. The screen illuminated the front porch in high-definition monochrome. I saw the badge first. It was a deputy sheriff's star. Catching the glare of the porch light, behind him stood a patrol car with its lights off, a silent predator in my driveway. But that was not what made my stomach turn over. I swiped to the camera covering the street corner, the blind spot hidden by the overgrown rhododendrons. There it was, a silver Lexus sedan, engine idling, exhaust puffing white clouds into the chill morning air. I knew that license plate better than my own social security number. It belonged to my parents. They were not here to visit. They were here to witness. I walked to the front door, tightening the belt of my silk robe. I did not chain the door. I threw it wide open. The cold air rushed in, biting at my bare ankles. Deputy Miller was a large man who looked like he would rather be anywhere else at this hour. He held a sheaf of papers in one hand and rested the other near his belt, not on his gun, but close enough to send a message. "Ms. Ridgefield?" he asked. Though we both knew he had already verified my identity. "Yes," I said. My voice was steady, void of the morning grogginess he probably expected. "I have an order here for immediate eviction," Miller said, thrusting the paperwork toward me. "Based on a default judgment issued yesterday regarding the unlawful detainer of this property, you need to vacate the premises, now." "Default judgment?" I repeated the words, tasting the metallic flavor of the trap. A default judgment happens when the defendant fails to show up to court. You cannot show up to a court date you were never notified of. "I have not been served with any lawsuit," I stated, not arguing, just establishing facts for the invisible record I was already compiling in my head. "The court says otherwise, ma'am. The owners, the Golden Horizon Trust, have been granted full possession." Golden Horizon Trust. The name sounded like a retirement home or a cheap scam. I reached out, not to take the papers, but to hold them steady. "Let me see." I raised my phone. "I am documenting this legal notice," I informed him. I snapped 3 photos, ensuring the text was legible. I zoomed in on the paragraph citing the transfer of ownership. According to this document, I had sold my aunt's home to this trust exactly 3 months ago and had been squatting here ever since, refusing to leave despite multiple warnings. 3 months ago, the timeline clicked into place. "Vera, please." The voice came from the sidewalk. I looked up to see my father, Thomas Ridgefield, stepping out of the shadows like a reluctant actor taking the stage. He was wearing his concerned citizen cardigan, his hands clasped together in a plea. He walked halfway up the driveway, careful to stay behind the deputy, maintaining a safety buffer. Don't make this hard on the officer, honey, Dad said, his voice trembling with a practiced sorrow. We have let you stay here for free for too long. We just want what is best for you. You need help, and you can't find it hiding in this big old house. It was a masterclass in manipulation. To Deputy Miller, this looked like a tragic family dispute, the loving, elderly parents finally putting their foot down with a leeching. Unstable daughter. Dad was painting a picture of my incompetence, layering the groundwork for a narrative of mental instability. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not ask him how he could do this. I looked at Deputy Miller. I am a tenant at will under Washington state law. Regardless of their fabricated claims, I said, my voice cutting through my father's performance. I have rights to retrieve essential medical supplies and professional equipment required for my livelihood. Miller hesitated. He looked at the shivering old man in the driveway, then back at the calm, cold woman in the doorway. The law was the law, however inconvenient. You have 15 minutes, Miller said, checking his watch. Grab your essentials, only what you can carry. Thank you. I turned on my heel and walked back into the warmth of the house. I did not run. Panic is for people who do not have a plan. I bypassed the bedroom. I bypassed the jewelry box containing my grandmother's pearls. I went straight to my office. I disconnected my primary work laptop, a machine that contained access keys to the most sensitive financial servers on the West Coast. I grabbed the 2 external solid-state drives hidden in the hollowed-out base of my desk lamp, my backups, my life's work, and the digital paper trail of every project I had managed for Ethelgard Systems. I shoved them into my leather messenger bag. I swept my passport and a wad of emergency cash from the safe into the side pocket. 12 minutes. I went to the bathroom cabinet. I grabbed a bottle of melatonin I rarely used and a prescription for anxiety I never took. Props for the narrative they were building. But necessary to justify my medical request, I threw a toothbrush and a change of underwear into the bag. I walked back downstairs. My house, my sanctuary, felt violated. The air inside already felt different, as if the oxygen was being siphoned out by the people waiting outside. I stepped onto the porch. Deputy Miller was waiting. My father had retreated to the Lexus. The passenger window was rolled down. My mother, Alice, was sitting there. She wore dark sunglasses. Even though the sun had not yet breached the horizon, she refused to look at me. She stared straight ahead, her jaw set in a line of grim determination. I walked past the deputy. I walked past the patrol car. I stopped right next to the Lexus. I bent down, bringing my face level with the open window. My mother flinched, just a fraction of an inch, but she did not turn her head. Look at me, I commanded softly. She didn't. Alice, I said. She turned. Her eyes were hidden behind the lenses, but I saw the twitch in her cheek. Keep the house safe, I said, my voice low, intimate, a promise rather than a threat. Keep it clean. Don't let the pipes freeze. Take care of it until I take it back. I didn't wait for a response. I straightened up, walked to my car, and threw my bag into the passenger seat. I ignited the engine, the roar of the motor the only sign of the rage burning in my gut. I did not drive to my best friend's condo in downtown Seattle. I did not go to a hotel. I needed a fortress. I needed a place where emotion went to die and logic reigned supreme. I drove toward the glass and steel skyline of the city. Navigating the waking traffic, I headed straight for the underground parking garage of the Larkin Moore building, the law firm that had been trying to poach me from Ethelgard for 2 years. They had empty offices, high-speed encrypted internet, and they owed me a favor. It was neutral ground. It was a war room. As I merged onto the highway, I checked the time. It was 6:30 in the morning. My parents thought they had won the day. They had no idea that the day had only just begun. The conference room on the 42nd floor of the Larkin and Moore building was sterile, smelling faintly of lemon polish and aggressive air conditioning. It was a vacuum, devoid of the sentimental clutter that filled my Victorian home. And right now, that was exactly what I required. I sat at the mahogany table. My laptop hummed, the only sound in the room. I was not Vera the daughter here. I was Vera the senior analyst, and I had a dataset to deconstruct. I navigated to the King County Superior Court portal. My fingers moved with muscle memory born of a decade of due diligence work. Most people see the law as a shield. I have always known it is a weapon. And right now, I needed to see the caliber of the bullet that had just hit me. I typed in the case number I had photographed from Deputy Miller's paperwork. The screen refreshed, displaying the docket for Golden Horizon Trust versus Vera Ridgefield. I bypassed the eviction order and went straight to the root directory, the foundational documents filed to establish the plaintiff's standing. I downloaded a PDF titled Exhibit A, Proof of Ownership and Authority. As the file opened, pixel by pixel, I felt the air in the room grow heavy. It was not a deed of sale. It was a durable power of attorney. I leaned in, the blue light of the screen reflecting in my eyes. The document was dated 6 months ago. The preamble was standard legalese, but the specific clauses were a masterwork of character assassination. According to this piece of paper, I, Vera Ridgefield, had voluntarily ceded control of my assets, including my real estate and liquid capital, to Thomas and Alice Ridgefield. The justification clause was highlighted in bold. It stated that the principal, me, had been declared temporarily incapacitated due to an acute mental health crisis involving severe paranoia and dissociation, rendering me unfit to manage my own affairs. I sat back, the leather chair creaking. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. This was not just about stealing a house. This was an execution of my identity. In my line of work, reputation is currency. I assess risk for billion-dollar mergers. If a document stating I was mentally incapacitated and suffering from paranoia ever leaked to Ethelgard Systems or the State Licensing Board, my security clearance would be revoked before lunch. My parents were not just evicting me, they were ensuring I would never have the financial means to fight back. They were scorching the earth. I forced my breathing to slow. Panic is a variable. Logic is a constant. I zoomed in on the signature line at the bottom of the page. My name, Vera Ridgefield. To the untrained eye, it was perfect. The loop of the V was sharp. The slant was consistent with my natural handwriting. But I do not have an untrained eye. I analyze patterns for a living. I magnified the image to 400%. I focused on the tail of the lowercase a at the end of my first name, in a natural signature. The pen moves in a fluid, continuous stroke, lifting off the paper with a tapering line. Here, the line was heavy, uniform in thickness, and right at the apex of the curve, there was a microscopic jaggedness, a hesitation mark. Someone had placed a genuine signature of mine under this paper and traced it. The hesitation came from the hand pausing, unsure of the curve. Checking the reference underneath, it was a forgery, but a high-quality one. I scrolled up to the date next to the signature. August 15th. I stared at the date. August 15th. The numbers floated in my mind, seeking an anchor in my memory. Where was I in the middle of August? I closed my eyes, accessing my internal calendar. August, the summer heat wave, the burnout I had been feeling after the merger with the Japanese tech firm. I had taken mandatory leave. I opened my eyes. A grim smile touched my lips. On August 15th, I was not in Seattle. I was not even in the contiguous United States. I was standing in a river in the middle of the Denali National Preserve in Alaska. I had booked a 2-week extreme survival tour, a digital detox designed to strip away the noise of the modern world. I had been thousands of miles away from this document, but as the triumph flared, it was immediately doused by a wave of cold pragmatic realization. I had been on a digital detox. The entire point of the trip was that there was no cell service, no internet, no digital footprint. I had surrendered my phone to the guide at the trailhead. I had not posted on social media. I had not sent emails. To a judge, my claim that I was in the Alaskan wilderness would sound convenient. Without hard data, it was just my word against a notarized legal document. and the document said I was crazy. A paranoid person would claim to be in the woods when they were actually signing away their rights in a lawyer's office. I needed to break the chain of custody of the lie. I scrolled down to the notary stamp block. The seal was embossed, the ink fresh. State of Washington, Notary Public, Brenda S. The commission number was visible. I copied it and opened a new tab. Navigating to the Department of Licensing database, I punched in the number. The results populated instantly. Brenda S. worked out of a business called Elite Signatures. I ran a quick search on the address. It was not a downtown law firm. It was a storefront in a strip mall in a decaying industrial district south of the city, sandwiched between a payday loan shark and a discount vape shop. A place like Elite Signatures did not deal in high-level corporate retainers. They dealt in volume, speed, and occasionally, a lack of questions for the right price. My parents and their unseen legal architect had chosen a budget notary, likely assuming no one would ever look this closely. They had made a mistake. They assumed the document would be the end of the conversation. They did not realize it was the start of an autopsy. I had the date. I had the forgery. And now, I had the weak link. Brenda S., a woman who worked in a strip mall and had stamped a lie that was about to bring her world crashing down. But first, I had to prove where I was on August 15th, and for that, I would need to dig deeper than just my memory. I needed data that I was not even sure existed. My parents were capable of cruelty, but they were incapable of complexity. The scheme laid out in the court documents was too elegant, too structurally sound for two people who still typed with their index fingers and wrote checks at the grocery store. The power of attorney was a precision strike, and my father was a man who used a sledgehammer to hang a picture frame. Someone else was holding the blueprint. I connected my laptop to the secure server at Ethelgard Systems. Technically, using company resources for personal vendettas was a violation of protocol. But I was the one who wrote the protocols, so I knew exactly where the blind spots were. I initiated a deep dive query into the entity known as the Golden Horizon Trust. The screen filled with cascading lines of code as the algorithm chewed through public records, shell company registries, and cross-border financial data. It took less than 40 seconds to strip away the veneer of legitimacy. The trust had been incorporated exactly 1 week before the date on the forged power of attorney. It was a newborn entity, created with the sole purpose of absorbing my assets, but a trust needs capital, or at least a benefactor. I traced the initial funding source. It was not a family savings account. The seed money, a significant sum meant to look like an initial deposit, had been wired from a holding company called Vanguard Holdings. I switched tabs, pulling up the portfolio for Vanguard. They were aggressive real estate developers known for gentrifying quiet neighborhoods into high-density hives. I pulled up the municipal zoning applications for my district. There it was. Vanguard had filed a preliminary permit request to rezone my street for a luxury condominium complex. My Victorian home, with its sprawling garden and oversized lot, was the linchpin. Without my land, their project was just a blueprint. With it, it was a gold mine worth tens of millions of dollars. But why would my parents agree to this? They loved that house, or rather, they loved the status of that house. I ran a separate financial diagnostic on my parents' Social Security numbers. The results were a wash of red ink. My stomach tightened as I saw the jagged graph of their liquidity. They were not just broke, they were underwater. I saw a series of frantic transfers to offshore exchanges. Crypto, my father, in his desperate attempt to remain relevant and wealthy, had poured their retirement savings into volatile altcoins right before the market corrected itself. He had lost nearly everything. The narrative was now complete. They were drowning in secret debt. Vanguard offered them a lifeline in exchange for the property, and the only obstacle was the rightful owner. So, they invented a version of me that was too insane to object. It was a cold, transactional calculus. Now I had the motive, I needed the alibi. I turned my attention back to the 15th of August. My memory was certain, but the law requires empirical evidence. I looked at my wrist. where my tactical smartwatch sat. It was a rugged piece of technology designed for alpinists, capable of tracking barometric pressure, blood oxygen, and precise geolocation without relying on a cellular signal. I synced the watch to my laptop. The transfer bar crawled across the screen. I opened the raw data file for August 15th. The screen populated with a telemetry map. At 10 in the morning on that Tuesday, the exact moment the notary log claimed I was in a strip mall in Seattle, my watch placed me at an elevation of 4,000 feet, deep within the Alaskan wilderness. I expanded the biometric data. My heart rate at that time was 110 beats per minute, consistent with a strenuous uphill hike. Not sitting in a chair signing papers, the GPS coordinates were logged every 30 seconds, creating an irrefutable breadcrumb trail through a valley that was 2,000 miles away from the notary stamp. I felt a surge of adrenaline. This was hard data. It was objective. However, I stopped myself. I knew how a courtroom worked. I could hear the opposing lawyer's voice in my head already. He would argue that digital data could be spoofed. He would claim I had given the watch to someone else to wear, or that I had hacked the logs. The metadata was strong, but it was invisible. I needed something tangible. I needed a ghost from the analog world. I opened my personal finance management software. I have a habit that borders on obsessive-compulsive. I scan every single receipt, no matter how small, and categorize it for tax purposes. If I bought a pack of gum, there was a digital record of the paper slip. I filtered the search. August 15th. Location: Alaska. One result appeared. It was a receipt from a remote refueling outpost called The Last Stop. The timestamp was 10:45 in the morning. I had paid in cash for 5 gallons of fuel for the rental Jeep and a bottle of water. I clicked on the image of the scanned thermal paper. The ink was faded, but legible. And there, at the bottom, was the golden ticket. Because it was a cash transaction in a remote area with an outdated register system, the clerk had asked for a signature to verify the rental agreement on file. My signature was scrawled across the bottom line. It was jagged, hasty, written while standing up and swatting away mosquitoes. It looked nothing like the careful, traced forgery on the power of attorney. Better yet, the receipt had a distinct, serialized transaction number and the handwritten initials of the clerk next to the date. It was a physical interaction with another human being in a specific place and time that physically precluded me from being in Washington state. I sat back, the glow of the monitors illuminating my smile. I had the motive. I had the digital footprint. And now, I had the paper trail. My parents had built a lie out of paper, thinking it would hold. They did not realize that I spent my life turning paper into fire. I did not call a lawyer. In the high-stakes world of corporate litigation, hiring counsel is often the first signal that you are bleeding. It triggers a feeding frenzy. Lawyers talk to lawyers. They golf at the same clubs and trade favors over scotch. If I hired a firm now, word would get back to my parents' legal representation before the ink was dry on the retainer. I needed the element of total surprise. I needed to be a phantom until the moment I walked into the courtroom. Instead, I opened a fresh document on my laptop and began to type. I knew the language of the court as fluently as I knew C++ code. I drafted an emergency motion to stay writ of restitution. Beneath that, I drafted a motion to vacate default judgment. The prose was stark, devoid of adjectives, and heavy with statutes. I was not asking for mercy. I was pointing out a procedural error so egregious it bordered on malpractice. I printed the documents in triplicate on the firm's heavy bond paper. To the legal arguments, I attached my exhibits. Exhibit A was a topographic map overlay of the Alaskan wilderness, with a red line tracing my GPS coordinates, timestamped to the second. Exhibit B was a redacted summary of my personal investment portfolio for the last quarter. It showed a net worth and a credit score that laughed in the face of any claim of financial incapacity. I was not a woman who needed a conservatorship. I was a woman who could buy and sell the people trying to conserve me. I drove to the King County Courthouse just as the lunch rush was dying down. The building was a gray monolith of justice. Smelling of floor wax and stale anxiety, I bypassed the line of weeping tenants and frustrated landlords and went straight to the clerk of the court's window. The clerk was a woman named Ms. Reynolds, a veteran bureaucrat with eyes that had seen every variation of human desperation. She looked at me, likely expecting another sob story about lost jobs or sick children. Instead, I slid the file across the marble counter with the precision of a blackjack dealer. "Emergency filing," I said. "Ex parte. I need this in front of the duty judge immediately." "Ms." Reynolds adjusted her glasses and pulled the file toward her. She flipped through the pages, her skepticism evident. Usually, people representing themselves, proselytigants, handed over handwritten messes stained with tears. My file was formatted to the exact margins required by the local rules. She paused at the GPS map, then looked up at me. Her expression shifted from dismissal to curiosity. "Wait here," she said. 20 minutes later, I was standing in the chambers of Judge Harrison. Judge Harrison was a legend in the local circuit, known for a temperament that ranged from mildly annoyed to volcanic. He detested wasted time and suffered fools not at all. He sat behind a desk that looked like a barricade, reading my motion while I stood silently. I did not fidget. I did not plead. I let the silence stretch until it was taut. He looked up, removing his reading glasses. "You are claiming you were in Alaska when this power of attorney was signed?" he asked, his voice a deep rumble. "The data is irrefutable, Your Honor," I replied, "as is the fact that I was never served with the original lawsuit. The plaintiffs filed a false affidavit of service to secure a default judgment behind my back." He looked back at the papers. "And you are representing yourself?" "For today." "Yes," he grunted. It was a sound of approval. He picked up his pen. "I am granting a temporary stay of execution on the eviction order for 48 hours. We will hold an emergency show cause hearing tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. If what you allege here is true, Ms. Ridgefield, this court has been used as a weapon, and I do not take kindly to that." He signed the order with a flourish that felt like a sword slash. I took the signed order and walked out. The first phase was complete. Now, I had to ring the bell. I used the court's electronic service system to notify the opposing counsel. The name on the original filing was Marcus Sterling. I knew the name. Sterling was a fixer disguised as a litigator. He was the man wealthy families called when their sons crashed sports cars or when their mistresses threatened to go to the press. He was expensive, slippery, and morally flexible. Seeing his name attached to my parents' lawsuit confirmed that they were not just desperate. They were being coached by a shark. I hit send. The notification would ping on Sterling's phone and my parents' email simultaneously, almost immediately. The phone in my pocket buzzed. I pulled it out. It was a text message from Mom. "Vera, please don't make this harder than it has to be. Do not drag this out. I am trying to save you from your own debt. Just let us help you." I stared at the screen. The audacity was breathtaking. She was trying to gaslight me via text message, while her lawyer was likely scrambling to understand why a judge had just halted their victory lap. She wanted me to react. She wanted an angry reply she could show to the judge tomorrow. Proof of my volatility and unstable nature. I did not type a single letter. I took a screenshot of the message, saved it to a folder named Evidence, and archived the thread. Silence was my shield. I left the courthouse and got back into my car. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long, bruised shadows across the city. I did not return to the safety of the law firm. I drove back to the house. The property was quiet. A neon orange sticker was plastered across the front door. The sheriff's notice of possession. Seeing it there, defacing the entryway I had restored with my own hands, made my blood run cold. But I did not cross the property line. Technically, until the judge ruled tomorrow, entering the house could be construed as trespassing, and I would not give Sterling that ammunition. Instead, I parked my car a block away and walked to the wooded strip of public land across the street. There was an ancient oak tree that overlooked my driveway, its branches providing a thick canopy of cover. I opened my bag and pulled out a long-range, motion-activated trail camera. another remnant of my hiking obsession. I climbed the lower branches with practiced ease, the rough bark scraping my palms. I secured the camera high up in the V of a branch, angling the lens so it had a perfect view of the front porch and the driveway. I synced the feed to my phone. On the screen, my house appeared, silent and seized. "Watch them," I whispered to the device. My parents and Sterling thought they had locked me out. They did not realize that I was now everywhere. I climbed down, brushed the moss from my coat, and drove away. I had 12 hours to prepare for the performance of a lifetime, and I intended to let them think they were still in charge until the very last second. The sun was beginning to bleed out over the industrial district south of Seattle, painting the cracked asphalt of the strip mall in shades of bruised purple and dirty orange. I sat in my car, the engine off, parked 3 rows back from the storefront of Elite Signatures. From this distance, the business looked even more pathetic than it had on Google Maps. The neon sign in the window flickered with an electrical death rattle, buzzing intermittently. This was where my life had been stolen, not in a high-rise boardroom, but here, between a dry cleaner that smelled of chemicals and a store selling discount vape pens. I was not wearing the comfortable clothes of a remote worker. I had changed into a navy blue blazer, a crisp white button-down, and severe, rimless glasses that I usually reserved for board meetings with hostile auditors. I held a clipboard thick with meaningless papers, old bank statements and utility bills I had grabbed from my glove compartment, arranged to look like an official dossier. My target, Brenda, appeared at 5:15. She looked exactly as I had profiled her. A woman in her late 50s, carrying the weight of the world in a slumped posture. Wearing sensible shoes and a cardigan that had seen better decades, she locked the glass door of her office, rattled the handle to check it, and turned toward a faded sedan parked under a flickering street lamp. I did not run up to her. I stepped out of my car and walked with a measured, predatory cadence. I let my heels click against the pavement, a rhythmic countdown announcing my arrival. "Ms. Brenda?" I called out. My voice was not the voice of Vera Ridgefield. It was the voice of bureaucracy, flat and terrifyingly indifferent. Brenda froze, her keys dangling in her hand. She squinted at me. "We are closed for the day, honey. Come back tomorrow." "I am not a customer," I said, closing the distance but stopping a respectful 6 feet away, close enough to intimidate, far enough to avoid a panic response. I flashed the back of a generic plastic ID card I had kept from a tech conference years ago, flipping it away before she could focus on the text. "I am Senior Investigator Davis from the National Notary Commission, Fraud Division. We need to talk about your license." The color drained from her face faster than water from a cracked basin. "My license? I have never had a complaint in 20 years. There is a first time for everything," I said, looking down at my clipboard and flipping a page with a sharp snap. "We are currently investigating a massive racketeering ring involving Vanguard Holdings and fraudulent property transfers. Your stamp has appeared on 3 flagged documents in the last 6 months, specifically, a power of attorney regarding the Ridgefield estate." I looked up, locking eyes with her. "Now, here is how this works. Brenda, you can be a person of interest in a federal fraud case, which involves freezing your assets and a subpoena for your hard drives, or you can be a cooperating witness. I have a lot of paperwork to file tonight. I need to know which box to check next to your name." Brenda dropped her keys. They clattered loudly on the asphalt. Her hands were shaking. "I didn't know about any ring. I just did a job." "You notarized a signature for a woman who was 4,000 miles away in Alaska at the time," I lied smoothly, layering the trap. "That is not a job. Brenda, that is a felony Class B. Did you knowingly falsify the logbook?" "No," she squeaked, her voice pitching up. "No, she was there. Mr. Sterling brought her in. He is a big lawyer. He said the daughter was having a mental breakdown. He said she was difficult." I kept my face impassive, though the mention of Sterling confirmed my theory. "Marcus Sterling represents the client. He is not the signer. You are telling me a woman claiming to be Vera Ridgefield stood in your office on August 15th? Yes, she was right there. Brenda was pleading now, desperate to shift the weight of the crime. She was quiet. She wore big sunglasses and a headscarf. Mr. Sterling said she was sensitive to light because of her medication. She just sat there, nodding. She signed the book. I checked her ID. I paused, letting the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable. You checked her ID, and the photo matched the woman in the sunglasses and the scarf? It looked like her, Brenda stammered. I mean, with the glasses it was hard to tell. But Mr. Sterling vouched for her. He said he was her conservator in all but name. I thought I was helping a sick girl. I felt a surge of cold fury. My parents had not just forged a signature, they had hired an actress. They had staged a piece of theater in this dingy office, reducing my life to a prop in a con artist's script. A woman in a scarf, playing the role of the broken daughters while my father stood by, likely sighing in fake paternal grief. I tapped the pen against my clipboard. Brenda, listen to me very carefully. The woman who signed that book was using a stolen identity. The real Vera Ridgefield has irrefutable biometric proof she was not in the state. Marcus Sterling set you up. He needed a rubber stamp. And he found one he thought was too stupid to ask questions. Brenda looked like she was going to be sick. She leaned against her car for support. He said it was standard procedure. He gave me $500 in cash as a rush fee. A rush fee, I repeated, my tone dripping with disdain. He bought your freedom for $500. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a digital voice recorder. I had it running the entire time, resting in the breast pocket of my blazer. I clicked the stop button, the mechanical sound loud in the quiet lot. Washington is a two-party consent state for private conversations. But we were standing in an open parking lot, in full view of the public street, where the expectation of privacy does not exist. It would hold up in a hearing for probable cause. I have your statement on record, I said. Brenda gasped, her eyes widening. You recorded me? I am building a case, I said. And right now, you are the only one telling the truth. That is good for you, but tomorrow morning, at 9 o'clock, there is an emergency hearing at the Superior Court. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a business card. It was not mine. It was a generic card from a bail bondsman I had picked up off the sidewalk weeks ago. I flipped it over and wrote a time and a courtroom number on the back. I am not going to arrest you tonight, Brenda, I said, handing her the card. She took it with trembling fingers. But Marcus Sterling is going to walk into that courtroom tomorrow and blame you. He will say you were negligent. He will say you failed to verify the signer. He will let you go to prison for 5 years to save his own license. I leaned in closer. The only way you stay out of a cell is if you walk into that courtroom and tell the judge exactly what you just told me about the sunglasses, about the rush fee, about Sterling vouching for the imposter. I can't go to court, she whispered. I'm scared. You should be, I said coldly. But you should be more scared of me than you are of him, because I have the data. He only has lies. I turned around and walked back to my car. I did not look back. I could hear her breathing, ragged and terrified. Behind me, I got into my vehicle, started the engine, and drove away slowly. In the rearview mirror, I saw her standing alone under the flickering street lamp, looking at the card in her hand. I had broken the chain of command. I had isolated the pawn. Now, I just had to wait and see if fear was a stronger motivator than greed, based on the sweat I had seen on her brow. I calculated the odds were heavily in my favor. The night air inside my temporary command center was stale, smelling faintly of ozone and cold coffee. But on the screen before me, the world was bathed in the crisp, artificial clarity of high-definition surveillance. It was 7:45 in the evening. Through the long-range lens of the camera I had hidden in the oak tree 3 days ago, the driveway of my aunt's villa looked like a stage set for a tragedy of manners. I adjusted the zoom, the servos whirring almost inaudibly in the silence of my room. A convoy of 3 black luxury sedans rolled up the gravel path. crunching over the stones with an arrogance that set my teeth on edge. They ignored the posted legal notices taped to the gate, notices that explicitly forbade entry. My father stepped out of the first car, looking for all the world like a king returning to a castle he had already surrendered in his mind. He was followed by my mother, who was wrapped in a fur coat that likely cost more than the average person earned in 5 years. Despite their pleading poverty to anyone who would listen, but it was the people trailing behind them who made my stomach churn. They were not family. They were not friends. They were the vultures. I recognized the branding on the files they carried immediately. Vanguard Holdings. These were the developers. The men in sharp suits with dull eyes who looked at history and saw only square footage. There were 4 of them, led by a man with slicked back hair and a posture that screamed aggressive negotiation. Even from a distance, I could see the way he surveyed the property, not with appreciation, but with the cold calculation of a butcher eyeing a carcass. I toggled to the second camera feed, the one angled toward the East Wing garden. The group moved toward my aunt's rose garden. This was not just a plot of dirt. It was a sanctuary cultivated over 40 years. Every bush had a name. Every trellis was placed with intention. The Vanguard representatives did not care. One of them pulled out a laser measuring device, shooting a red beam across the blooming beds. I watched as he made a chopping motion with his hand, gesturing to the heavy machinery access road. They were planning to pave it. They were discussing how to rip out 4 decades of life to make room for a heated swimming pool, or perhaps a garage for cars they did not yet own. My finger hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly, not from fear, but from a rage so cold it felt like ice in my veins. I forced myself to breathe. Emotion was a liability. Documentation was ammunition. I switched views again, following them as they breached the front door. I had remote access to the interior security cameras, a fact my parents had blissfully overlooked in their rush to liquidate my inheritance. The living room feed flickered to life. There was my father. Walking straight to the liquor cabinet, he bypassed the casual spirits and reached for the top shelf. He pulled down a bottle of Chateau Margaux, a 1996 vintage that my aunt had been saving for a wedding she never got to attend. He didn't decant it. He didn't let it breathe. He popped the cork and poured it into mismatched tumblers for the developers, as if it were cheap table wine. He was toasting to the sale, laughing with his head thrown back, the sound muted by the technology, but deafening in my memory. My mother was busy in the background. She was walking through the room with one of the junior associates, pointing at the furniture. I zoomed in on her hands. She was slapping sticky notes onto the antique mahogany sideboard, the velvet armchairs, even the grand piano. She was appraising the furniture for a quick sale, likely to a liquidator who would haul it away for pennies on the dollar before the probate court could freeze the assets. She looked manic, her eyes darting around the room, calculating how much cash she could extract before the sun came up. It was a violation. It was a desecration of a memory. But as I watched my father clink glasses with the man who wanted to bulldoze the roses, the pain inside me hardened into something useful. I stopped being the grieving niece and became the prosecutor. I started snapping screenshots. Click. My father is holding the stolen wine. Click. The Vanguard representative holding blueprints inside a sealed property. Click. My mother is selling assets that were currently under a court-ordered freeze. I recorded a 3-minute clip of the lead developer discussing demolition timelines, his lips clearly readable even without audio. I opened a secure email client. I did not address this to my parents. Engaging them was a waste of energy. I went for the throat. I found the direct email address for the General Counsel of Vanguard Holdings, a man whose job was to ensure the company did not get sued into oblivion. I typed the subject line, "Severe legal risk at Ridgefield Project regarding trespassing and asset tampering." My fingers flew across the keys. I adopted the tone of a bored, high-priced litigator. I informed them that the property they were currently touring was subject to an active injunction. Case number 459-B. I explained that their employees were currently documented trespassing on a frozen estate and were complicit in the theft of high-value assets. I attached the court order I had secured earlier that day, along with 5 high-resolution photographs taken 10 minutes ago. I wrote that if their team was not off the premises within 10 minutes, I would be filing a motion for contempt of court against Vanguard Holdings directly, citing their executives by name. I noted that the timestamp on the photos would prove they were aware of the dispute and proceeded anyway. I hit send, then I waited. On the screen, the party continued. My father was refilling the glasses. The lead developer was laughing at something, looking relaxed, confident in his imminent profit. 1 minute passed, then 2. At the 3-minute mark, the mood in the room shifted. The lead developer felt a vibration in his jacket pocket. He pulled out his phone, looking annoyed at the interruption. He glanced at the screen, and his expression went from annoyance to confusion, and then to absolute pallor. He held the phone up to his ear, his posture stiffening. I could not hear the screaming on the other end of the line, but I could see the result. The general counsel at Vanguard was likely flaying him alive. Corporations hate risk, and I had just presented them with a legal landmine. The developer hung up the phone. He didn't finish his wine. He set the glass down on the coasterless table, a final insult, and barked a sharp command to his team. The junior associates stopped measuring the drapes immediately. They packed their lasers and their tablets with the speed of people who realized they were standing in a burning building. My father looked bewildered. He stood there, holding the bottle of 1996 Margot, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He tried to grab the developer's arm, likely to ask what was wrong, but the man recoiled. The Vanguard rep said something brief and harsh to my father, pointing a finger at the door, then turned on his heel and marched his team out. I switched back to the exterior camera. The vultures streamed out of the house, practically running to the black sedans. Engines roared to life. Gravel sprayed as they reversed out of the driveway, desperate to put distance between themselves and the lawsuit I had promised them. In less than 5 minutes, the driveway was empty of everyone except my parents. They stood alone in the courtyard, bathed in the yellow light of the porch lamps. My mother was clutching her fur coat, looking around as if the lawn itself had betrayed her. My father looked at the bottle in his hand, then at the retreating taillights, and finally slumped. The arrogant king and the desperate queen were left ruling over a kingdom of silence. They had no buyer, they had no demolition crew, and most importantly, they had no check coming in the morning. I took a sip of my cold coffee. It tasted bitter, but the satisfaction that settled in my chest was sweet. I had not just stopped a sale, I had humiliated them. I had cut off their supply line. They were stuck in a house they could not sell, with bills they could not pay, and enemies they could not see. I saved the video file and named it Evidence Batch 1. This was just the appetizer. The real course was yet to come. I leaned back in my chair, watching my parents argue silently on the screen, and for the first time in months, I smiled. The roses were safe for another night. The heavy oak doors of Courtroom 4 swung open at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. The air inside smelled of floor wax and old paper, a scent designed to intimidate anyone who did not speak the language of the law. I walked in alone. I carried a single, slim briefcase and wore a charcoal blazer that I had bought specifically for its neutrality. I did not look like an heiress, nor did I look like the unstable addict my parents were about to paint me as. I looked like an accountant, or perhaps a librarian, someone boring, someone reliable. My parents and their legal shark, Arthur Sterling, were already seated at the plaintiff's table. Sterling was a man who seemed to have been manufactured rather than born. His suit was a midnight blue silk blend that likely cost more than $5,000, and his teeth were whitened to a degree that appeared predatory under the harsh fluorescent lights. He did not look at me. He was too busy arranging his papers with geometric precision, projecting an air of absolute, unshakable confidence. My parents, however, were putting on the performance of a lifetime. My mother, who usually would not leave her bedroom without diamonds, was wearing a modest gray cardigan and minimal makeup. She looked tired, her shoulders slumped in a posture of maternal defeat. My father sat beside her, rubbing his temples as if the weight of the world rested there. They had cast themselves perfectly as the long-suffering victims, stepping in to save their wayward daughter from herself. The bailiff announced the arrival of Judge Harrison. We all rose. Judge Harrison was a man in his 60s with a face etched by decades of listening to lies. He took his seat, adjusted his spectacles, and looked down at the docket. Sterling wasted no time. When he stood up to give his opening statement, his voice was a rich baritone, filled with practiced sorrow. "Your Honor," Sterling began, placing a hand over his heart, "we are not here today out of greed. We are here out of necessity. My clients, Mr. and Mrs. Ridgefield, are heartbroken. They have watched their daughter, Vera, spiral into a state of severe mental instability for the past 2 years. The petition for power of attorney is not an attempt to seize assets. It is a desperate rescue mission." He walked toward the bench, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that carried clearly to the back of the room. He painted a picture of a girl lost to paranoia, insisting that I had cut off contact with reality. He used words like delusional, erratic, and incompetent. "We have reason to believe," Sterling continued, gesturing vaguely in my direction without making eye contact, "that the defendant is struggling with significant substance abuse issues, which has led to wild hallucinations about her family plotting against her. This paranoia is the classic symptom of a mind in decline." Then came the physical evidence. Sterling produced a thick file and handed it to the bailiff to pass to the judge. "These are records from the Pinecrest Wellness Center," Sterling said. "They document a consultation from 6 months ago where Miss Ridgefield was diagnosed with acute persecutory delusional disorder. The prognosis suggested that without strict supervision, she would be a danger to her own financial and physical well-being." I sat perfectly still. I knew Pinecrest. It was a private clinic known for writing whatever wealthy families paid them to write. I had never set foot in the place, but the paper in the judge's hand said otherwise. Judge Harrison flipped through the file, his brow furrowed. He looked over his glasses at me, and for the first time, I saw genuine concern in his eyes. It was the look one gives to a wounded animal that needs to be put down for its own good. "Miss Ridgefield," the judge said, his voice grave, "these are serious allegations. The court takes the mental capacity of a ward very seriously. You have chosen to represent yourself today, which, given the contents of this report, might not be the wisest course of action. Do you have anything to say?" Sterling smirked. It was a microscopic movement of his facial muscles, but I saw it. He thought he had already won. He expected me to scream, to deny it, to act exactly like the paranoid, hysterical woman he had described. I stood up. I did not smooth my skirt. I did not look at my parents. I looked directly at Judge Harrison. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady and cold, "I do not intend to debate the state of my mental health with Mr. Sterling. He deals in adjectives. I prefer to deal in geography and physics." The judge blinked, clearly surprised by the shift in tone. "Physics, Miss Ridgefield?" "Yes, Your Honor. The cornerstone of Mr. Sterling's argument relies on the timeline presented in that medical report. If you look at page 3, the date of my alleged in-person psychiatric evaluation is August 15th of last year. The report states I was physically present at the Pinecrest Clinic in the city for a 4-hour observation starting at 10 o'clock in the afternoon." The judge glanced down at the paper. "That is correct. That is physically impossible," I said, "because on August 15th at 10 o'clock in the afternoon, I was 3,000 miles away in Anchorage, Alaska." I opened my briefcase and retrieved a labeled folder. I approached the bench and handed it to the bailiff. "Exhibit A," I announced. "These are my GPS logs from my rental car, authenticated by the rental agency. Exhibit B contains the physical receipts for a purchase of gasoline and a bottle of water, time-stamped at 10:45 in the afternoon on that specific day in Anchorage." Sterling was on his feet instantly. "Objection, Your Honor. This is ridiculous. Digital GPS logs can be altered. Anyone can edit a metadata file. And as for receipts, We are expected to believe a scrap of paper proves identity? She could have given her credit card to anyone. An accomplice could have been in Alaska while she was here in the city, getting diagnosed. The judge looked at the receipts, then back at Sterling. He seemed hesitant. Sterling pressed his advantage. Your Honor, a receipt proves a purchase, not a presence. This is exactly the kind of elaborate, conspiratorial fabrication that confirms her diagnosis. She has gone to great lengths to fake an alibi to avoid treatment. My parents were nodding vigorously in the background. My mother even dabbed at a dry eye with a handkerchief. I waited for Sterling to finish. I let his words hang in the air until the silence stretched thin. Mr. Sterling is correct, I said, turning to face the courtroom. Receipts can be carried by others. Data can be spoofed, which is why I did not rely solely on my own records. I pulled a USB drive from my pocket. Your Honor, I request permission to play a video file. It is 30 seconds long. The judge nodded slowly. Proceed. I plugged the drive into the court's presentation system. The large screen on the wall flickered to life. I am a data analyst by trade, I explained as the file loaded. When I saw the forged medical report in the discovery files 2 days ago, I knew I needed independent verification. I wrote a script to scrape social media platforms for public posts tagged with the location of that specific gas station in Anchorage on August 15th. Sterling shifted uncomfortably in his suit. I searched for the hashtag Alaska Adventure. I continued. And I found this. The video began to play. It was shaky. Wide-angle footage taken from a GoPro camera strapped to the helmet of a motorcyclist. The timestamp in the corner read August 15th, 10:48 in the afternoon. The audio was filled with the roar of engines and the laughter of tourists. The motorcyclist was filming his friends filling up their bikes. But in the background, clear as day, stood a woman at the adjacent pump. She was wearing a thick red parka. She was filling a blue sedan. She turned her head toward the noise of the motorcycles. Looking directly into the camera lens for a full 3 seconds, it was me. There was no mistaking the face. There was no mistaking the scar on my chin or the way I tied my hair back. The high-definition video captured every detail. Pause, I said. The image froze on my face. Your Honor, I said, my voice cutting through the stunned silence of the room. Unless I have developed the ability to bilocate, or unless Mr. Sterling is suggesting that these random German tourists traveling through Alaska were part of my conspiracy to fake a mental health evaluation 6 months in advance. Then the medical report you are holding is a forgery. And if the medical report is a lie, then the entire premise of this motion is fraud. I turned to look at my parents. My mother had stopped crying. Her face had gone completely pale. My father was staring at the screen, his mouth slightly open. Sterling was furiously whispering something to his junior associate, his confident facade showing its first structural crack. I was not at the Pinecrest Clinic, I concluded. Looking back at the judge, I was buying unleaded fuel in Anchorage, and I submit that a woman capable of finding a needle in a digital haystack using complex data mining algorithms is not mentally incompetent. She is simply smarter than the people trying to steal from her. The judge stared at the frozen image on the screen. He looked at the date. He looked at the face. Then he looked at the medical report in his hand. Slowly, deliberately, he closed the medical file and set it aside. The sound of the file hitting the wood of the bench echoed like a gunshot. Mr. Sterling, the judge said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerously quiet. I suggest you explain to this court why you have submitted a document that appears to be a direct fabrication of evidence, and I suggest you do it very carefully. Sterling stood up, tugging at his collar. For the first time all morning, the shark looked like he was the one bleeding in the water. The silence that followed the Alaska revelation was absolute. It was the kind of silence that usually precedes a natural disaster, a vacuum where the air is sucked out of the room before the shockwave hits. Everyone was looking at Arthur Sterling. The shark was sweating. It was a fine sheen of perspiration on his upper lip, the only crack in his otherwise immaculate armor. He stood up slowly, smoothing his silk tie, attempting to regain the rhythm of the room. Your Honor, Sterling began, his voice lacking its earlier resonance. While the video is entertaining, digital timestamps are notoriously unreliable. Cameras can be reset, settings can be tampered with. We cannot dismiss a sworn medical affidavit based on a GoPro video that could have been filmed at any time. It was a weak parry, and he knew it. But I was not interested in playing defense anymore. I was ready to go on the offensive. Mr. Sterling makes a fair point, I said, turning to the judge. Technology can be fallible, so let us rely on something more traditional. Let us rely on the human element. I walked back to my table and picked up a different file. If Mr. Sterling insists that I was here in the city signing legal documents while my doppelganger was fueling a car in Alaska, then we must examine the moment of signature itself. I call Brenda Miller to the stand. My parents stiffened. My mother's hand flew to her throat, clutching her pearls as if they were a lifeline. Brenda Miller was their notary, a woman they had used for 20 years. She was a fixture in their social circle, the kind of woman who knew where the bodies were buried because she had notarized the shovel receipts. Brenda took the stand. She was a woman in her 50s with hair sprayed into a helmet of blonde curls and a nervous tick in her left eye that was currently working overtime. She took the oath, her voice trembling slightly. Sterling approached her first, trying to salvage the narrative. Mrs. Miller, do you recognize the defendant? Vera Ridgefield? Yes, Brenda said, her eyes darting toward my parents before settling on me. I have known her since she was a child. And on August 15th, Sterling continued, emphasizing the date, did Vera Ridgefield appear in your office to sign the power of attorney documents? This was the moment. She could recant. She could say she made a mistake. She could save herself. But Brenda looked at my father, who was staring at her with intense, desperate pressure. She looked at Sterling, who nodded encouragingly. Fear won out over honesty. Yes, Brenda said, her voice gaining a fragile strength. It was Vera. She came to my office around 3 in the afternoon. She seemed agitated, but she signed the papers in my presence. I am 100% certain. A ripple of murmurs went through the gallery. Sterling exhaled, looking relieved. He shot me a look that said, "Nice try, but you lose." "Your witness," Sterling said, sitting down with a smirk. I walked toward the witness stand. I did not smile. I did not look aggressive. I looked curious. Mrs. Miller, I began softly, you run a very reputable business. Strict adherence to the law is your trademark, is it not? It is, Brenda replied, lifting her chin slightly. And part of that strict adherence involves verifying the identity of anyone signing a document, correct? Even if you know them personally? Absolutely, she said, falling into the trap of her own professionalism. It is the law. I always verify identity. Excellent, I said. So, on August 15th, when this person who you claim was me entered your office, you asked for government-issued identification? I did. And what form of identification was presented? I asked. A state driver's license, Brenda answered promptly. And did you follow the standard protocol of recording the details of that license in your official notary logbook? I did, she said, sounding offended that I would even question her competence. I recorded the license number, the expiration date, and the date of issue. It is all in the logbook I brought with me today pursuant to the subpoena. She pointed to a thick, black-bound ledger sitting on the ledge of the witness stand. I turned to Judge Harrison. Your Honor, I would like to direct the court's attention to a specific timeline of events involving my personal property. 3 months ago, on November 10th, I reported my wallet stolen. My mother let out a small, sharp gasp. She remembered the wallet. She should. She was the one who had taken it from my bedroom while I was sleeping, likely to gather the very ID they needed to pull off this fraud. I continued, ignoring her reaction. When a driver's license is reported lost or stolen, the Department of Motor Vehicles does not just issue a copy, they issue a new card with a new security audit number, also known as a document discriminator number. This is done specifically to prevent identity theft. The moment the new card is issued, the old card is flagged in the state database as void and invalid. I pulled a document from my evidence folder. This is the official confirmation from the DMV. It shows that my old license, the one contained in the wallet that went missing, was canceled on November 11th at 9 in the morning. A new license, with a completely different audit number, was mailed to me a week later. I turned back to Brenda, whose face had drained of all color. The nervous tick in her eye was back, violent and uncontrollable. "Now, Mrs. Miller," I said, my voice hardening. "If I was truly standing in your office on August 15th, I would have presented my valid, current driver's license, the one in my pocket right now." I reached into my blazer, pulled out my license, and held it up. "However," I continued, "if an imposter, perhaps someone who looked somewhat like me, or perhaps no one at all, presented an ID to you, or if you simply copied the numbers from an old ID provided to you by my parents to facilitate this fraud, then the numbers in your logbook will match the stolen, voided license." The courtroom was deadly silent. The air conditioner hummed, sounding like a jet engine in the quiet. "Your Honor," I said, "I ask that you inspect Mrs. Miller's logbook. If the audit number recorded there matches my current license, then I am a liar, and I will sit down. But if the number matches the license that was reported stolen 3 months ago, then Mrs. Miller has just perjured herself, and my parents are in possession of stolen property." Judge Harrison did not hesitate. "Bailiff, bring me the logbook." Brenda looked like she might faint. She clutched the book for a second before the bailiff gently pulled it from her hands. The book was carried to the bench. The judge adjusted his glasses. He motioned for me to hand up the DMV report with the 2 different license numbers. He opened the ledger. He ran his finger down the page. He looked at the DMV report. Then he looked at the ledger again. He took a long, deep breath. "The record in the notary logbook," Judge Harrison announced, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls, "lists a document discriminator number ending in 492. He looked at the DMV paper. "The valid license issued to Miss Ridgefield ends in 881. The number ending in 492 belongs to the license reported stolen and canceled on November 11th. The judge slammed the book shut. The sound made Brenda jump in her seat. "Mrs. Miller," the judge said, and his voice was no longer that of a weary arbiter, but of a furious instrument of the law. "You have testified under oath that you physically inspected the identification of the signer. Yet, you have recorded the details of an identification card that was invalid and, according to the defendant, stolen. This implies that either you accepted a voided ID from an imposter, or you never saw the signer at all and simply transcribed numbers given to you by a third party." Brenda burst into tears. It was an ugly, sobbing sound. "They told me it was fine," she wailed, pointing a shaking finger at my parents. "Arthur said it was just a formality. He said Vera was sick and couldn't come in, but they needed to save the estate. He told me to just copy the info from the old ID they found." Pandemonium broke out. Sterling jumped up, shouting, "Objection! Hearsay! The witness is distressed." "Sit down! Mr. Sterling!" Judge Harrison roared, banging his gavel so hard the wood handle cracked. "You will sit down and remain silent, or I will have you held in contempt this instant." I stood in the center of the chaos, watching the dominoes fall. My mother was weeping into her hands, but they were not tears of sorrow anymore. They were tears of terror. My father was staring at the table, his face gray. The lie had not just been exposed. It had been dissected, analyzed, and laid bare with the cold precision of the physics I loved so much. "The court finds," the judge said, his voice shaking with suppressed rage as the room quieted, "that the power of attorney document is a fraudulent instrument. It is null and void immediately." He turned his gaze to the plaintiff's table. "Furthermore, given the witness's admission of conspiracy involving the plaintiffs and their counsel, I am referring this entire matter to the District Attorney's Office for criminal investigation regarding fraud, perjury, and identity theft. Sterling slumped into his chair. He looked small. The shine was gone from his suit. The predator had become the prey. I closed my briefcase. The click of the latches felt like the final period at the end of a very long sentence. I did not look at my parents as I turned to leave. There was nothing left to say to them. The numbers had done all the talking. The courtroom had devolved into a spectacle of unraveling lies. But I was not done. I was merely clearing the board of the pawns so I could capture the king and queen. Brenda Miller was still weeping on the witness stand. Her professional veneer stripped away to reveal a terrified woman realizing she was facing prison time, under the crushing weight of the judge's stare. She finally cracked completely. She raised a shaking hand, not to wipe her eyes, but to point a finger directly at the plaintiff's table. "It was her!" Brenda shrieked, her voice high and thin. She was pointing at my mother. "Elaine brought the woman in. She told me it was Vera. She said Vera was too sick to get out of the car, so she brought in a look-alike. She told me it was a twin cousin or something. I didn't know. I just did what I was told." My mother gasped, recoiling as if she had been slapped. "You lying witch," she hissed, forgetting her role as the grieving, concerned parent. "I never said that." Sterling tried to intervene, standing up with his hands raised in a futile gesture of surrender. "Your Honor, clearly the witness is distraught and Sit down." "Mr. Sterling," I cut in. My voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. I did not look at him. I kept my eyes fixed on the judge. "The witness is not unreliable. Your Honor, she is simply late to the truth. But her testimony regarding the fabrication of my presence is only the surface. We need to address the architecture of the lie." I walked back to my table. My movements were slow, deliberate. I felt a strange detachment, as if I were watching a simulation rather than my own life. I picked up a thick stack of papers, bound with a heavy clip. "Mr. Sterling suggested earlier that my paranoia led me to imagine conspiracies," I said, addressing the room. "But as any data analyst knows, nothing is ever truly deleted, especially not when one party is arrogant enough to believe they are untouchable." I held up the stack. "My father, Richard Ridgefield, believes that moving a file to the trash bin on his desktop computer is the same as destroying it. He is mistaken. What I hold here are the recovered data packets from his cloud synchronization logs. Logs that I, as the administrator of the family plan, he forgot to remove me from. Have legal access to." I handed the files to the bailiff. "These are email exchanges between my father and his counsel, Arthur Sterling, dated 3 weeks before my alleged mental breakdown." Sterling's face went the color of ash. He slumped into his chair, covering his eyes with one hand. He knew what was coming. "Allow me to read from Exhibit C," I said, opening my own copy. "An email from Mr. Sterling to my father, dated August 22nd. Subject, the medical issue." The text reads, "Richard, if we cannot get her to sign voluntarily, we need a medical bypass. I have a contact at Pinecrest who will write the evaluation for $5,000. Provided you have a history of her being erratic, start documenting outbursts now. If she doesn't have outbursts, provoke them." A collective gasp swept through the gallery. The judge's jaw tightened, his knuckles white as he gripped the bench. "And here," I continued, flipping the page, "is the reply from my father. Dated 2 days later, money is not an issue once we sell the house. Just make sure the power of attorney is watertight. If she won't sign, Elaine says we can find someone who looks enough like her from a distance. Just tell Brenda to look the other way." I lowered the paper. This was not a desperate attempt to save a sick daughter. This was a premeditated acquisition strategy. I was not a patient to them. I was an obstacle to be liquidated. My father had his head in his hands. He was trembling, but my mother was staring at me, her eyes burning with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. She could not comprehend that the quiet girl who spent all day on her computer had just outmaneuvered them so completely. But even with the fake doctor and the coerced notary, I said, turning to face the final piece of the puzzle. They had a problem. The imposter could stand in for my body, but she could not replicate my hand. Handwriting is unique. It is muscle memory. It is biometric data. I approached the projector screen again. The signature on the power of attorney document looks authentic. It looks exactly like mine. In fact, Mr. Sterling would likely argue that it is too perfect to be a forgery. I clicked a button on my remote. 2 images appeared on the screen side by side. On the left was the signature from the fraudulent legal document. On the right was a scan of a colorful piece of cardstock. This, I said, pointing to the image on the right, is a birthday card I sent to my father 5 years ago. It reads, "Happy 50th, Dad, love, Vera." I clicked the button again. The image of the birthday card faded, leaving only the signature in red ink. Then, the signature from the legal document, in blue ink, slid across the screen. It moved slowly until it sat directly on top of the red signature. They were identical. In forensic handwriting analysis, I explained, my voice clinical and cold, there is a concept called the principle of natural variation. No person signs their name exactly the same way twice. There will always be microscopic differences in spacing, pressure, and angle. It is humanly impossible to replicate a signature with 100% geometric accuracy. I pointed to the screen, where the blue and red lines had merged into a single purple image. There was not a single deviation, not a pixel of difference. These signatures match perfectly, I said, which means the signature on the legal document was not written by a human hand. It was scanned from this birthday card, lifted in Photoshop, and printed onto the power of attorney form. They stole my well wishes from 5 years ago and used them to sign away my future. The brutality of the act hung in the air. It was one thing to steal money. It was another to cannibalize a gesture of love for profit. The judge looked at the screen, then at the defendants. His expression was one of profound disgust. "Mr. Ridgefield," he said, his voice low. "Mrs. Ridgefield, is there any explanation for this? Any explanation at all?" My father could not speak. He was broken, but my mother stood up. She was shaking, her face flushed with a sudden, violent rush of blood. The mask of the victim shattered completely. "I gave birth to you!" she screamed, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical shriek that echoed off the high ceiling. She pointed a trembling finger at me, ignoring the judge, ignoring the bailiff moving toward her. "I carried you for 9 months. I fed you. I clothed you. You owe me. You owe us that house. It is ours. We made you. So everything you have belongs to us." The courtroom erupted. The raw, ugly entitlement in her voice was a confession more damning than any email or forensic overlay. It was the sound of a parent who saw their child not as a person, but as property. "Order!" Judge Harrison bellowed, standing up and banging his gavel with furious force. "Order in this court! Bailiff, restrain the defendant!" The bailiff moved in, placing a hand on my mother's arm as she continued to shout incoherently about ungrateful children and the cost of private schools. My father remained seated, shrinking into himself, wishing he could disappear. I stood there, watching them. I should have felt sad. I should have felt the heartbreak of a daughter watching her family disintegrate, but I felt nothing. My pulse was steady. My breathing was even. I looked at my mother being forced back into her chair by the bailiff, and I did not see a parent. I saw a failed investment strategy. I saw a variable that had been solved and removed from the equation. "The court has heard enough," Judge Harrison said, his face red with anger. "This is the most egregious abuse of the legal system I have witnessed in 20 years on the bench. The motion for power of attorney is denied with prejudice. Furthermore, I am issuing an immediate bench warrant for the arrest of Arthur Sterling, Richard Ridgefield, and Elaine Ridgefield on charges of conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery of legal documents, and perjury." Sterling put his head on the table. He was finished. His career was over. I packed up my laptop. I placed the forensic reports back into my briefcase. I did not look at the 3 people who had tried to erase me. I had analyzed the threat, isolated the data, and executed the deletion protocol. The file on the Ridgefield family was now closed. The sound of the gavel striking the wood block was not loud, but it possessed a finality that echoed in the marrow of my bones. It was the sound of a heavy door slamming shut, locking the past away. Judge Harrison did not mince words. In a voice that stripped the room of any lingering ambiguity, he declared all documents executed under the fraudulent power of attorney to be null and void ab initio, the legal term meant from the beginning. It was as if their scheme had never existed in the eyes of the law. My ownership of the Ridgefield estate was restored with immediate effect, absolute and unencumbered, but the judge was not finished. He turned his gaze to the bailiff stationed at the back of the room, with a subtle nod that felt like the dropping of a guillotine blade. He authorized the immediate execution of the bench warrants. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted from administrative to visceral. 2 uniformed officers moved toward Arthur Sterling. The once impeccable lawyer did not protest. He stood up, smoothing his suit jacket one last time, retaining a ghost of his professional dignity even as he offered his wrist to the officers. He was charged with forgery, suborning perjury, and obstruction of justice. He knew the game was over, and he knew how to lose with the cold calculation of a man who was already planning his plea deal. My parents were a different story. They did not understand the grace of defeat. When the officers approached the plaintiff's table, my mother recoiled as if the policemen were dirty. She looked around the room, her eyes wide and frantic, searching for an exit that did not exist. The charge was conspiracy to commit fraud and grand larceny, identity theft. These were not white-collar misunderstandings. They were felonies. The click of the handcuffs securing my father's wrists was a sharp, mechanical sound that cut through the murmurs of the gallery. He looked small. The arrogance that had fueled him for decades, the entitlement that made him believe he could drink my wine and sell my home, had evaporated. He looked at me then. It was a look of profound confusion, as if he still could not understand how the tool he had created, his daughter, had turned into the weapon that destroyed him. My mother began to weep again, but this time it was quiet and desperate. As the officer took her arm, she turned her head toward me. Her makeup was smeared, her face a mask of ruin. "Vera," she whispered, the name cracking in her throat. "Vera, please, we are family." It was the ultimate manipulation, the card they always played when logic failed. They stared at me with pleading eyes, silently begging me to intervene, to tell the judge it was all a misunderstanding, to save them from the consequences of their own greed. I looked at them. I looked at the hands that had held me as a child, and I looked at the eyes that had viewed me as an asset to be liquidated. I felt a phantom ache in my chest, the ghost of the love I had once desperately wanted from them, but I also felt the weight of the evidence file in my hand. I remembered the email where they discussed hiring an imposter. I remembered the sale of my furniture. I did not speak. I did not nod. I simply turned my back. I walked toward the heavy oak doors, my heels clicking rhythmically on the floor. I heard my mother call my name one last time, a high, thin sound, but I did not break stride. I pushed the doors open and walked out into the bright, blinding light of the midday sun. I was an orphan by choice, and I had never felt more free. I returned to the villa 2 hours later. The first thing I did was call a locksmith. I did not wait for the sun to set. I had every lock in the house changed, replacing the old mechanical tumblers with high-grade biometric scanners and smart locks that only I could control. I purged the security system of all previous user codes, wiping my parents' digital fingerprints from the servers, just as surely as the police had removed their physical presence. The house was silent. For the first time in months, it did not feel like a battleground. It felt like a home. I began the process of cleaning. I did not want to keep their ghosts in my hallways. I went into the guest wing they had occupied. It was a mess of packed boxes and half-empty wine bottles. I methodically went through the drawers, looking for anything that belonged to the estate. In the bottom drawer of the bedside table, hidden under a stack of silk scarves, I found a black leather ledger. It was worn at the edges. I opened it, expecting to find contacts or perhaps diary entries. Instead, I found numbers, columns and columns of red ink. It was a gambling record. I sat on the edge of the bed, reading the history of their ruin. It went back 10 years. My father had not just made bad investments. He had gambled away their fortune at high-stakes tables in Macau and Las Vegas. My mother had not been a passive victim. She had her own column. Debts owed to private lenders with names I did not recognize, but whose interest rates were clearly predatory. The total debt was staggering. It was over $4 million. Everything fell into place. The desperation to sell the house, the frantic speed of the liquidation, the risk they took with the forgery. It wasn't just greed. It was panic. They were being hunted by sharks far more dangerous than Arthur Sterling. They had tried to throw me to the wolves to save themselves. I closed the book. I felt a strange sense of pity, distant and cold. They were not just villains. They were addicts, hollowed out by their own vices until there was nothing human left inside. I tossed the ledger into a trash bag. It was not my debt. It was not my story. 3 weeks passed. The spring air began to warm the stone terrace. One morning, a letter arrived with the morning mail. It bore no return address, but the stamp was from the state correctional facility. The handwriting on the envelope was my father's, spidery and shaking. I stood by the kitchen island, holding the envelope. I could guess what was inside. Apologies, excuses, requests for money for the commissary, or perhaps blame, perhaps a final attempt to guilt me into dropping the charges. Even though the state had already taken over the prosecution, I did not open it. I did not need to know. Their words had no value anymore. Their currency had collapsed. I walked over to the heavy-duty shredder I had installed in my office. I fed the unopened envelope into the machine. The blades whirred, a sharp, grinding noise that lasted for 3 seconds. The letter was reduced to confetti. I felt lighter. I decided not to sell the house. The developers would not get their concrete swimming pool. Instead, I began a new project. The villa was too large for one person, and I had no desire to live in a mausoleum. I converted the ground floor into my permanent workspace, a headquarters for my data analysis firm, but the upper floors, with their sun-drenched rooms and views of the rose garden, I gave a new purpose. I reached out to a nonprofit organization that specialized in helping victims of financial abuse and domestic fraud. I offered the space as a transitional sanctuary, a safe harbor for women who, like me, had been told they were crazy, who had been stripped of their assets by the people who were supposed to love them. It was fitting. The house that they had tried to steal to pay for their sins would now be used to heal the wounds they had inflicted. The story ends on a Tuesday morning. I sat on the porch, a cup of hot coffee in my hands. The steam rose in the cool air, swirling in the sunlight. The garden was vibrant. The roses were in full bloom, a riot of red and pink that defied the gray suits who had tried to pave them over. My phone lay silent on the table. The notifications were turned off. There were no urgent emails from lawyers, no frantic texts from family members. There was only the sound of the wind in the oak trees and the distant song of a thrush. I took a sip of coffee. It was rich and dark, exactly how I liked it. I had walked through the fire. I had been burned. Yes. The scar on my heart would likely never fully fade, but I had come out the other side carrying my own life in my hands, heavy and solid, and undeniably mine. People say blood is thicker than water, but when that blood turns septic, the only way to survive is to amputate the necrotic tissue. I did not lose my parents. I simply removed 2 grifters from my life, and as I looked out over the garden that was finally, truly safe, I realized that was not a loss. It was a liberation. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed this journey of justice and resilience. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. Please leave a comment below telling me which country you are in right now. It is amazing to see how our community connects from all over the world. If you enjoyed this episode, Please consider subscribing to the channel Sunday Drama Stories. Give this video a like, and hit that hype button to help this story reach even more people. Your support means the world to us. See you in the next story.